Special thanks to Cars of Somerset for providing the Ferrari in this review, and of course, as always, I've linked to their website right below this video in the description, where you can check out in particular their current stock, which does change pretty regularly, so you'll probably want to check in fairly often, or alternately, if there's something specific that you want to find, maybe a different car that I've reviewed from them, then of course you can commission them to find a car for you as well. There are a handful of vehicles already in Beards and Cars which don't exactly fall under the typical parameters of a used buying guide style review. And the most notable other example aside from this one is probably the Aston Martin Vanquish S from the earlier 2000s. A stunning looking car, 6 figures even used, and yes, it's an investment and certainly a stunning supercar to own. But it's not exactly the kind of car where you're going to talk about miles per gallon and luggage space so much, and certainly not the lower end of the price spectrum, given that if you can afford one at all, you're probably going to try and find a well-loved one. At the same time though, much like other channels such as Jay Leno's Garage, these videos can also be enjoyed by people who can't afford a car like that, but just love to look at them and hear about them and learn things that maybe they didn't know before, and potentially even learn what these cars are actually like to drive in real-world conditions. And that's always been one of the goals of Beards and Cars, to take away the abstract Top Gear test track kind of scenario which doesn't really give us much of a point of reference, and actually put these hardcore extreme supercars on the road and see what they're actually like to drive in real conditions. Because let's be honest, that's sometimes where things can fall apart, sometimes literally in the case of certain supercars. So when you come into driving a Ferrari for the first time, as this was for me, my first Ferrari experience, there's a lot on the line. Now, I am not a super fan of Ferrari. I have a lot of respect for them, I like a lot of their cars, but they're not necessarily like a top 5 brand for me. However, my dream car is a Ferrari, the FF, which is probably the least Ferrari ever to Ferrari. But this one is kind of the exact opposite. This is the most Ferrari to ever Ferrari. The F355 is, in my opinion, kind of the pinnacle of being right on that summit between old school and new school, because this one took up the baton from the 348 and was superseded by the 360. It was available in 3 primary forms, those being the coupe, convertible and targa, or as Ferrari calls them, the Berlinetta, the Spider, and this one, which is the GTS. And on a slight side note, a very personal note, I love Targa top cars. In fact, 9 times out of 10 I will choose a Targa top over a full convertible. I just love the way they look. I think it looks really cool, and it gives, again, an extra element of kind of dual personalities, where it kind of looks and feels like a coupe, but then it can just become a convertible at the drop of a hat. And the ultimate example is probably the Maserati MC12. But in terms of the kind of, you could say, optional extras in an abstract sense that you can expect from one of these if you do choose to buy one, if you're fortunate enough to be in that position, the kind of options are very different to what you'd expect from a modern car, because this ran from 1994 to 1999. And this one in particular, the GTS, was introduced in 95. Now, the F355 is not a rare car by any stretch. They built over 11,000 of these. Now, of those 11,000, 2,500 were this one, the Targa Top GTS. But out of those, this one that I'm driving is the more common, the 6-speed manual. And in fact, overall, the manual is a lot more common than the flappy paddle option, which they call the F1. Once again, in the case of the Targa Top, they built 2,000 manuals and 500 F1 gearbox cars. Now, of course, with me being me, I would have ideally chosen the flappy paddle option because, as many of you know, I'm not a huge fan of manuals. Now, that will put some people off. The hairs on the back of your neck may go up if you're a traditionalist, and chances are if you're a fan of a Ferrari F355, you probably are. But don't click away just yet, because that brings me to another very interesting point. Being as I am not as much of a fan of manual cars, Can this one win me over? How much did I enjoy it despite that? Because it's not the only manual car I've reviewed, and certainly not the only one I've driven, and most of the motorcycles that I've driven and ridden have been manual as well. So, what is the car actually like to drive with that manual in its targa top form? And also, for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the kind of spec that this one had, what are you actually working with? Well, the car itself is relatively small. It's much smaller than a modern supercar, for example. The interior, as you'd expect, is a little smaller as well, although I will give it top marks for effort, because it's a tiny Italian car for tiny Italian people, and yet I did actually fit in it surprisingly well. I won't call it the most comfortable thing ever, my head was outside of the roof, but I fit in it enough to drive one. And to me, that gets top marks, because when I tried to drive a TVR Chimera, I couldn't, put simply, but that one had an issue with the seat. But to get back to the spec for just a second, of course it's a mid-engine car, rear-wheel drive, 6-speed manual, as I said, very old school, very simple. The engine is a 3.5 litre V8, which is an improvement in a number of ways over the 348 which it replaced. It's got significantly more power, it's a little bit larger as the name suggests, and they actually focus not just on engine improvements, but on transmission as well, not just adding the paddles, but with better cooling and operation. So it has just a better gearbox experience overall than a 348 does. And as you'd expect, with 375 horsepower, 268 pound-feet of torque, which is 363 newton meters for those who prefer that unit of measurement, the performance is very strong. And again, this is kind of a common thing in these more bare-bones sports cars from, for instance, TVR, Porsche with the 911, Ferrari with the F355. What they can actually do with the power that they've got to work with is sometimes more impressive, especially in my opinion in terms of top-end speed compared to what you might think they could do. This, with 375 horses, can do 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, and has a top speed of over 170. Now, I read up that Ferrari themselves claim it'll do about 183 if you go beyond the red line, but you're looking at more like 175 in practice. At least that's what the general consensus seems to be. Now, what about the handling? Because a car that's smaller, 90s Italian, bare bones kind of race car for the street vibe, it could very easily go either way. It could be the most fun you've ever had, or it could be horrendous. Well, I fall right in the middle, because I certainly didn't dislike driving this car. In fact, spoiler alert, I found the handling on this one significantly better to work with than the Audi R8, which is surprising to me. At the same time, because of that more old school approach, and especially with the mid-engine rear-wheel drive layout, the small, lightweight physical proportions, and just the more old school approach that it has to high performance, you can definitely feel it has that twitchier front end. The turn-in is excellent nonetheless, but it means that if you are going to push it more to its limits, as much as you can at least on UK roads, you do need to know what you're doing. You need to have experience with stuff like this. You can't jump from like a, what I would usually drive even, like a big heavy SUV or GT car, and expect to immediately master something like this. You have to have experience with stuff like 911s. If you can master a TVR, then chances are this will be easy in comparison. That's the kind of level that you need to be to get the best out of something like this. With that being said, however, I was surprised actually how forgiving the car is. It's a lot more comfortable than it easily could be. The gearbox was actually a pleasure to work with, and the only real demerit I can give it in terms of quote-unquote real-world driving at, normal to moderate speeds on UK roads in start-stop traffic sometimes, around roundabouts, etc., is that I personally found, maybe this is just me rather than the car, it's hard to say, I found that the throttle in particular operates a little bit too much like a switch for my liking. It doesn't really feel like there's any variation in there. It's either on or off. And that, in lower speed traffic in particular, gave me the feeling of the car being a little bit jerky and juddery, where you'd kind of try to ease your foot onto the throttle and it would kind of lurch forward. And that was nothing to do with, having it in the wrong gear or using the clutch wrong. I'm talking just already rolling, doing 20, 30 miles an hour and then rolling on that throttle. It would kind of jump forward a little bit more aggressively than I wanted it to. And again, it's the kind of car that wants to be driven hard, so that's not necessarily a problem if you plan to just use it as a weekend toy. And that brings me right into my next point, because that is precisely what this car is, and that's a key difference between this and, for example, something like the aforementioned Aston Vanquish, because that, for as over the top and as supercar level as it is, you could use that every day if you wanted to. Of course, the fuel bills would be high. It's not the most practical thing around, but it does have 4 seats and a trunk, so you could use it if you wanted to. This, in my opinion at least, for what it's worth, is not really the kind of car that I would ever want to use on a daily basis, even with the paddles, because it's a little bit too race ready. And that's not a bad thing. It's almost like asking someone to put up a picture with a scalpel or perform an operation with a hammer. It's just not the right tool for the job. This car wants to be driven hard, and it wants to be driven on smooth roads in sunny weather and not really have that much traffic around it, which in the UK is a lot to ask. For those things to all converge is like once every decade maybe, so it's not the kind of car that most of the time you're going to get the most use out of, but as a weekend toy, it has the wow factor, it sounds great, it does have a very nice manual gearbox to work with, again coming from somebody who's not a fan of manuals, and the handling, the playful nature, having just the right amount of power as well as a crucial thing, because there are some people, Clarkson included, who will have the joke of more power is always better, and under general circumstances I might not even disagree with that. Again, if it's a large heavy car, you can't really have too much power. See Nissan GTR, Bugatti Veyron, Porsche Panamera, they're great examples. But with this, I would say that potentially even 400 horsepower would probably feel like too much. And that's only about 25 more than it has. You start getting up to 450, 500, it would become, in my opinion, an unpleasant experience to work with, because it's just not really that kind of car. It's almost like having a Lotus Elise with 700 horsepower. Unless you've got a massive amount of downforce and basically turn it into a time attack car, there's not much point, because you can't use half of that. This, I would say, is exactly where it should be. About the 350 to 375 horsepower region is perfect for this car. Now, going back to the point which I mentioned earlier on about some very interesting options which this vehicle had, one of them is that, of course, you can choose whether or not you want the manual or the paddles. That's not completely uncommon, but there are other options, like, for instance, some of these cars don't have power steering, and some of them do. That's not the kind of option you're going to see on many cars these days, and that again, of course, is for people who want that even more pure experience, and chances are plan to drive it even harder and rarely, if ever, use it in city traffic. And personally, a fascinating little tidbit about this car which I loved, which I was not aware of before, and I'm sure some of you are and some of you aren't, is that the seating positions are actually asymmetrical. The driver's seat is a little bit closer to the center line of the car to give you a more ideal driving position. That's cool. It's not quite a McLaren F1 sitting in the middle, but it's a very cool idea to do something like that. I'm not so sure about how the passenger would feel, but from the driver's position, it was cool. And looking back, yeah, I could kind of notice that, and you might even be able to kind of tell that from the footage. Now, if for whatever reason you do decide to potentially bring out one of these cars as a longer distance toy, maybe for instance you want to join a car club and do, coastal drives or tours in whatever country you happen to be in, can it do that? To some degree, yes. Now, the fuel tank is reasonably good for what it is. It's 82 litres, which is 18 gallons, and in real-world conditions you're going to get about 16 miles per gallon, which again for a Ferrari is not bad at all. That means that you're looking at a range of about 280 miles to its tank. Again, for a non-GT car, it's not a tourer by any stretch. That's not bad at all, which means of course that if you do ever plan to use one of these on a longer distance journey, hopefully in sunny conditions to get the best out of it, then you can. And you're not going to be filling up every 5 minutes. Now, of course, you're not going to be driving ideally, so expect it to be a little bit less than 280 miles, but still, it shows that it has that capability if you so choose. Ultimately, if you are interested in terms of what kind of price you can get one of these for, of course you've got the option of the coupe, the open top, the targa, you've got the manual, you've got the F1, so there are a number of things that go into it. Obviously stuff like colour, mileage, condition, that will always play a role, and whether or not the car is intended to be more of a collector's piece or a show car, as some of them are. Those tend to be the very expensive ones, and some of them which have clearly been used and enjoyed. Well, on the lower end, if you are looking to buy one of these and actually use it, you should be looking at the 60 to 70 grand region. You can find a few of those, in fact, here in the UK on Auto Trader in a number of forms. For that kind of price, you can get the hardtop, the convertible, this one, and you can even get some with the F1 paddle gearbox for that same kind of price region. So that's not an unrealistic expectation to have. On the other hand, if you were looking to have one to be like a show-winning car or just a collector's piece that you hardly, if ever, drive, which seems a shame, but some people do that, then you can easily pay well over 100. I believe the highest one on Auto Trader currently, at least at the time of releasing this video, is like 140 grand, and that's got only 2,000 miles on the clock in about 25 years. So again, you really can pay as much or as little as you want. Well, maybe not as little as you want, but as much as you want for a car like this. 60 grand to 70 will get you a nice driver's version, and about 100 to 140 will get you like a show car. And I actually personally find that fairly refreshing, because within the exotic car world, Ferrari or otherwise, you don't actually tend to see that happen that much. And what I mean by that is, most supercars, for example, tend to have a very high price range, and everything falls under that. You don't, for instance, see high mileage Mercedes SLR McLarens for sale for half price. You don't see 40, 50,000 mile Veyrons for sale. You do, however, see F355s that have been driven. You see Porsche 911s that get driven every day. Even in the case of my own car, the Jag XKR, it's a GT, but I use it all the time. This is that kind of car, and I like the fact that people actually use them. It shows that it can be done, that the car can be used under those conditions and still keep a huge amount of its value, but it also gives you the option of whether you want to buy something, as I said, just as a collector's piece to look at in effect, or if you actually want to use it. And knowing that you can, and knowing that the car can, is pretty nice, I think. So ultimately, my verdict on the F355 as A non-Ferrari superfan, and B, certainly not a fan of manual gearboxes, is I really liked it. I wouldn't necessarily call it one of my favourite cars of all time just yet, but I personally believe that as far as introductions go, this is probably the best car I could have possibly driven as my first Ferrari experience. Of course, I wouldn't have chosen it as my first, I would have chosen the FF, but I think that in terms of what Ferrari offers and represents, and especially when it comes to old meets new in terms of their philosophy, this is, as I said earlier, pretty much the pinnacle. But ultimately, that's it for this review. Of course, stick around on the channel for more, and be sure to click either one of the videos on screen, such as that Vanquish review, or the playlist to see all of the episodes of Beards and Cars. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.